You can go there. Take it away, Dr. K.
Awesome. Thank you. Can you see them okay, Jen?
I can, and I'm going to go on mute.
Perfect. Well, yeah, so it was, I've got a weird background, right? Dairy and poultry, it never seemed quite relevant until the first diagnosis of influenza in dairy cows. B313 is what we call it. So anyways, I'm going to give some background from a poultry perspective of how this essentially impacts the poultry industry, and specifically focused part of my presentation on the B313 variant, which is, or I should say genotype, which is essentially the genotype that we've seen spill over into dairy animals and spread dairy to dairy, and also we're seeing it spill back into poultry. So if I can get it to advance, maybe, there you go. I've been playing with AI lately, and I put this together. This is a very serious issue, but one thing I found with a lot of the veterinarians that we've been dealing with this from the first diagnosis is you have to have some degree of levity throughout this, or else you'll go a little bit crazy. So just when we thought HPAI couldn't get much worse for U.S. poultry, then the dairy industry said, "Hey, here, hold my beer." So let's move in to talk about influenzas in general, right? So when we have influenza in poultry, they change. They are RNA viruses, and they make a lot of mistakes when they divide. And these mistakes can accumulate as they move into new hosts. And over time, they change. And single point mutations accumulating over time, we call that genetic drift. So it's kind of a slow accumulation of mutations. Now, there's also this concept with influenza viruses of change called genetic shift. And what that essentially means is you have two different influenza viruses, say H5N1 and H3N2 as an example, that infect the same host. And I liken their genomes to sort of decks of cards, if you would, right? And when they infect the same host, they can trade cards, and ultimately resulting in a new deck that has different properties. And those properties might do nothing, or they might make the virus change to become more virulent or infect new species. So really, it kind of depends on what's exchanged between those two viruses. And it's a bit like Russian roulette with respect to what you get for it. Hopefully, you don't get a virus that has a bullet in the chamber. So what happens when flu viruses change? They can become more virulent, so stronger. You can see a reduction in infectious dose, meaning it takes less to infect an animal. And it can spread to new species, which is essentially what we saw in late 2023, early 2024, which looks like a single introduction from a wild bird source into a dairy cow with this B313 genotype. So I want to talk a little bit about what we can learn from poultry. The poultry industry has been dealing with influenza for much longer than the dairy industry, particularly influenza A. And ultimately, I think there are some lessons we can learn there, particularly as it relates to how the industry has grown to manage low pathogenic avian influenzas, which is essentially sort of like what the B313 strain, or I keep saying strain, but it's truly genotype, is doing in dairy cows. We're not seeing real high pathogenicity in the sense that the mortalities are relatively low. Most operations, 4% and under. We're seeing some differences in California being reported, but that's a bit difficult to determine whether the virus is changing in these instances or whether it's just a greater denominator because there's so many more cows in California. And ultimately, in order to determine that, we need more data associated with the sequences that are being dumped for analysis. And what I mean by more data is temporal data. So when those samples were collected, what region they were collected from. And then from the field vets, we need feedback on specific farms, for instance, morbidity and mortality rates to see if those changes or mutations are correlating with an increase in virulence in the virus. So that's why that information is important. It's not to identify a farm and go after them necessarily, but really to keep an eye on the virus to understand how it's changing over time. So let's focus a little bit on low pathogenic avian influenzas. So for all practical purposes, and I borrowed a lot of these slides from Dr. Carol Cardona. She's kind of like the flu fairy in the poultry space. So thank you to Carol for providing these to me. But for all practical purposes, in a closed population that has influenza, this population will eventually clear the virus if all of the hosts within that closed population seroconvert. Now, these populations must be closed and limited in size. So if new animals are introduced, they can get infected and the virus will perpetuate itself in that open population. So in the poultry space, there are certain industry practices like I've listed down here below. I'm not going to go through all of them, but that just gives you some insight into how a poultry operation can sometimes be an open population. And on the dairy side, as I'll refer to in a couple slides, we do see constant turnover to the tune of 30% of new replacements added to a dairy herd every year. Now, if these animals are coming in as naive hosts, it allows the virus an opportunity to perpetuate itself. And so what has the poultry industry done in instances of low path avian influenza? So there's a term called controlled marketing if it is a meat breed like a turkey, or if it is a bird that is used for eggs, we refer to it as controlled product marketing. And this is a strategy that allows poultry that are infected with low pathogenicity H5 and H7 viruses to move to market on a limited basis. So H5s and H7s in birds can be both either low pathogenic or high pathogenic, and that's dictated by the degree of mortality. So in a low pathogenic strain of virus, we can perhaps close that population down and utilize control marketing strategies. And again, on the egg laying side, this is called controlled product marketing, but it requires that we close down that population and that the birds return to production after the insult of the virus, and that there is a place for them to sell their eggs. So the term controlled product marketing has been used to talk about how we apply this to egg layers. And again, it relies on seroconversion of the birds, clearance of the virus, and recovery of the bird value by marketing product through normal channels. So a lot of parallels to this and the dairy industry, perhaps, and maybe some learnings we can translate over. So in summary, you recover from the flu most of the time, right? Birds do too. So a flock or a farm can recover if the population is closed. So if we keep bringing in replacement animals over that duration, it's not closed, right? Controlled marketing was designed to recover bird value through normal channels. And controlled marketing uses the bird's immune system. So we're not vaccinating the birds or anything like that in these instances. We are closing down the population, allowing the birds to get infected, and allowing the immune system to respond to the infection and the bird seroconvert. So ultimately, that requires holding the birds for seroconversion. So in the case of broilers, where the grow out course is so much shorter than, say, turkeys, for instance, controlled marketing is not a strategy that can necessarily be utilized. And then how can we adapt this to cows, right? Ultimately, I talked about the fact that in the dairy industry, there's a continuous source of naive hosts, given that we replace 30% of the dairy herds roughly per year with naive replacements. So, based on some of the serology data that we've run, we're seeing 10 to 15% of non-lactating animals are seroconverting on affected operations. So again, if we're throwing these animals into a herd, that allows that virus to perpetuate itself. All right. So let's talk about high path avian influenza. This is This is a term used for an H5 or H7 that has acquired the ability to infect more tissues throughout the bird's body. And as a result of that, you see a higher mortality rate in these birds if you just were to let the infection take its course versus a low pathogenicity strain. And when we look at the transmission dynamics across poultry species, the broilers, so your meat birds, tend to be more resistant. And that's defined by having a lower seroconversion rate and a lower viral replication. On the other side of the spectrum, turkeys have a higher seroconversion rate and higher viral replication. So they essentially shed a lot of virus. So talking about this B313 genotype, I pulled this data from essentially the USDA reports that announce the flocks that have been impacted and the numbers, and I correlated that with the next strain genetic sequencing. And what I calculated out from that is that since April, when we started to see essentially this dairy outbreak start to gain steam, we've lost 21 million commercial birds. And April 2024 was the deadliest month in US history for HPAI losses, and that was 8.8 million birds lost in April. Now, a caveat here, I included these commercial broilers. They were reported as being positive in Tulare County. They have not yet been confirmed as B313, but I put it in there. So this may change if they are to come back and say, hey, it's not the bovine genotype, but I would be surprised if it's not. Additionally, we have another 800,000 birds in Washington and 150,000 birds in Oregon that we're waiting to see what the genotypes come back on those. I think Washington will end up being a wild bird sourced genotype, and I'm not sure about Oregon yet. So a lot of bird loss, right? So what is the protocol when a farm is defined as having a positive HPAI case? In the United States, the gold standard at this point is stamping out. And it's critical to stamp out this virus, meaning depopulate that premise within 24 hours of a positive diagnosis, maximum 72 hours, and we'd like to keep it under 24. And if we look at the process, sort of the USDA response plan for this virus in poultry, it is extraordinarily well defined, and that comes from years and years of dealing with this virus. So number one comes detection, quarantine of the flock, and essentially confirming that the virus is a high path avian influenza. And then during that time, appraisal is essentially undertaken to determine what indemnity would be paid out to this particular producer. Number three, obviously, is depopulation. We want to depopulate these birds as fast as possible to limit onward spread of the virus. Number four is disposal. So what do we do with those carcasses? Ultimately, it'll depend on the state, as does the depopulation tactic. Some states, like the state of California, do not allow for composting and burying on site, whereas others do. So it's really dependent on the state for number four. Number five is virus elimination. So they go through and they clean out the facilities to ensure that future flocks don't get infected with the residual virus that's left. Number six is testing, and that's essentially making certain that there is no viable virus left to infect new flocks. And then number seven is restocking, which has to go through USDA and state officials. They must approve it before the facility can be restocked. And then the maintenance of biosecurity. So extraordinarily well defined. So I pulled this from the USDA, some of their materials, and this is basically summarizing why it's important to depopulate these flocks so quickly. And that's because high path virus is shed in significant concentrations from an infected flock. But you think about it, it's kind of the same on dairy. There's high environmental contamination with high path AI. Probably the same in dairy and in cattle. It creates a serious biosecurity challenge for responders dealing with infected material. Very similar. And high path AI causes economic and One Health implications. Same in cattle. And so you can see there's some control dichotomies where in the poultry side, the domestic poultry side, it's a nationalized plan. It requires depopulation of positive flocks and all birds on the site. So you might have barns that are positive next to barns that are negative. The negative barns have to be depopulated too to avoid onward spread. And nothing leaves that farm without contamination within 14 to 30 days after the depop. There's shared maps and transparencies between regulatory agencies and producers. There's routing and communication, which is the key to controlling this virus and preventing lateral spread between operations. This is very different from the response in cattle, which is state by state. Only lactating dairy cows have been managed and monitored, and that relates to movement across state lines. Milk from affected cows is apparently diverted, but we're finding 1 in 5 shelf samples with dairy samples that have H5N1 RNA in it. So it's likely that we have asymptomatic shedders, and perhaps not all affected cows are getting diverted out of the saleable milk bulk tank. There's limited state shared network notifications, and the processors and milk truck drivers, they have to find out on their own. This information isn't directly shared with them. So again, an extensive and rapid spread of H5 influenza in dairy herds has created a new source of virus in this shared ecosystem. And we're seeing that spill back into our commercial poultry at alarming rates. And what are the implications of repeated depopulations? I've spoken to a number of clinical poultry vets out there, and there's huge mental health implications for this, for the producers, for the workers, for the depop crews, for the veterinarians that have to go through this. And on some of these facilities, this is a recurrent thing that they're having to go through. And so just extraordinarily mental health implications for it. And then surrounding this very well-defined process, there's tons of paperwork and responsibilities post-depopulation. And then if you consider the workers in these facilities that are depopulated, they lose jobs, some of them, they lose hours. And it's not just on the farms, it's in the processing facilities as well, whether it's an egg processing facility or a turkey slaughter facility, there's impacts on people and their livelihood with this. And, I don't have to give a lesson in economics to tell you, as we see this impacting more operations, the supply that's available is decreasing. And so if you look at sort of the table egg layer inventory from 2019 to 2024, this particular outbreak started in 2022. So you can see that was a drastic drop in bird numbers during that time. And we started to sort of recover in 2023. And then with the introduction of the bovine genotype in April of 2024, you can see that the bird numbers are dropping again. And I took this picture from my local grocery store here in Colorado. This is having impact on local markets that rely on regional egg producers to provide products. And at the end of the day, as the supply goes down, then the pricing to the end user goes up. And so this has major impacts, and there's a lag time, right? So if you have birds that are depopulated, it's like a 6-month lag time for repopulation in some instances, because birds take 18 to 20 weeks to reach sexual maturity. And a lot of these operations don't have backgrounders, for instance, like we do in cattle, that essentially can feed into this system immediately. So it creates sort of these lulls in availability and increase in price for the consumer. And the diagnosis of HPAI in a region comes with major trade wars. And so I posted just some of the publications I could pull from popular news, particularly basically illustrating just that. So this is from Hong Kong. After the West Texas facility was depopulated in April, they were no longer accepting poultry products from that region of Texas. Here you can see that in early October of this year, we stopped accepting certain poultry products from Canada due to HPAI outbreaks in birds. And Japan and the US earlier this year in May basically banned imports from Australia due to an H7 outbreak that they were dealing with. And, the implication also on utilizing vaccine is major with respect to trade as well. So, in France, they have a robust duck market, and the ducks are known to sort of amplify the high-path avian influenzas and increase risk for lateral spread to other operations. So France was talking about potentially vaccinating their duck populations, their commercial duck populations, and the U.S. said, I sat down and listened to a talk by Dr. Charles Martins Ferreira, who's from the French embassy, and he was saying, yes, the U.S. was very supportive of us vaccinating our ducks. And so, they said, yes, 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 you should, encouraged us. And then we pulled the trigger in October of last year, started vaccinating ducks, and days later, essentially, the U.S. banned French imports on poultry products. So truly trade wars at their finest. And so what is the major barrier to vaccinating poultry and potentially cattle? Numero uno is trade, as I've listed there and described in the previous slide. Now, with deciding to adopt vaccination, there's also other things that need to be addressed, such as monitoring of vaccinated populations. They call this DIVA for short, differentiating infected from vaccinated animals. And so this essentially makes it so that you can tell your export markets that what you're sending to them isn't something that's contaminated with live influenza virus. And this comes at a cost. It comes at a cost due to the expense of molecular tests, serological tests associated with it to essentially prove freedom from infection. Also, with influenza vaccines, we really are limited to two major technology buckets. The first being inactivated vaccines, so killed vaccines, and the second being recombinant vaccines. With these technologies, there's an inability to mass vaccinate. And so when we're talking about millions of birds, it's truly a much more difficult task if we have to go through and handle and vaccinate each one of them by hand. And then there's this concept of immune evasion. You'll hear a lot of people talk about this with influenzas. Ultimately, the vaccination will provide some sort of selection pressure. And so over time, there will become an antigenic distance that increases between the circulating strains of influenza and what that vaccine covers. And so you need to continually keep an eye on it to make certain that the antigenic distance is reduced and that vaccine still provides coverage for the at-risk population. So these are, as I recognize, the major barriers to utilizing vaccination. There is one bird in the United States that is vaccinated for highly pathogenic avian influenza, and this is the California condor. It's an ugly looking thing, but it is vaccinated due to its endangered status. Okay, so ultimately, as you can probably appreciate, the poultry veterinarians are getting quite frustrated with the situation in dairy cattle because the virus is spilling back over into their clients' populations. And so earlier this year, the American Association of Avian Pathologists got together and decided that they were going to put together a statement with regard to this B313 genotype in cattle. And ultimately, in summary, what this says is they're calling for more comprehensive testing in all classes of cattle. At this point, we've limited the narrative to be very much a lactating cow narrative. And with that, kind of ignored the potential that there might be non-lactating cows, beef animals contributing to the spread of this. And so ultimately, they're asking that we at least look at it so that we know whether it's a risk factor or not. It might not be, right? But if we don't look at it, we can't answer that question. And also, they're calling for a national strategy that targets all hosts, mammalian and avian. And they're asking for more timely epidemiologic investigations with rapid sharing of results. And Dr. Lombard will talk about this. He is diligently working on this, thankfully, and has been sharing his information rapidly. And so hopefully you'll hear some of that today if he's gotten on. The group is also asking for a reconsideration of vaccination of all at-risk populations, including cattle and potentially including poultry as well. And finally, calling for more lab capacity, producer support, and veterinary resources. And I have to echo the fact that these resources must include clinicians, because clinicians are our ears and our eyes in the field, and we have to keep them with a spot at the table to address this virus. Now, the last thing I want to present is, there's a lot of talk about trade sort of getting in the way. And I'd hazard to guess that one of the reasons the government's been cautious with this response is due to the balancing act of maintaining trade in the face of foreign animal disease. And so I've graphed here the US export dollars out by industry. And this is with 2023 numbers. So the dairy industry is sitting at about 8 billion, beef about 10 billion, poultry about 5.5, and so on. Now, I recently read a journal article that talked about the financial implications of a pandemic. Now, this virus has the potential to become a virus that causes a pandemic. Will that occur? No, not necessarily, but we have to prepare for the worst and hope for the best. And so I wanted to put up the amount of money that was attributed to losses associated with COVID in the US. And that's to the tune of $16 trillion. So I went ahead and graphed that on the same graph as our poultry, dairy, beef, pork, and egg exports. And you can see that you can't even see those on the graph. And so the cost relative to the cost of trade is there's very little comparison should we not get a handle on this sooner than later. With that, I want to thank you for your time, and I hope other speakers have been able to jump on.
Thank you, Dr. Russo. That is amazing. And we have our full complement of the amazing folks. So thanks for that. I think you actually set the stage well, even though it was maybe in the reverse order that I originally planned. I think it probably turns out better. And again, the goal of this was really to provide an opportunity for folks to gain a better understanding of what is an ever-changing situation. I didn't venture to pull these folks together. There's nothing about pointing fingers or blame here.
Thanks, Dr. Walker. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. Thanks so much for this opportunity to get to join you all this afternoon. And thanks to Dr. Russo for giving us such a comprehensive update on what's happening in the poultry world. So my goal today is just to share with all of you the clinical perspective of what happened here this spring. And if you hear background noise, I apologize. I am in the airport, so hopefully this is a quiet spot. So what I like to do for the next 20 minutes is just ruminate together. And I know there's folks on the call that are cow people, and there's folks on the call that maybe aren't cow people. So I'll do my best to try to include the cow and non-cow jargon for everyone. So ruminating obviously is the action of digestion for the cow and moving the feed through her 4-compartment stomach. So let's talk about a few things, right? So the first thing I would love to talk to you all about is the process we went through, how we define this disease specifically on farm, the symptoms that are associated with it, and a lot of the challenges that come up when we are trying to find these girls, right, and detect these girls. Especially from the very beginning, we had a lot of challenges in just understanding what this was and wrapping our arms around a diagnosis. Secondly is about supporting everybody on farm, right? Supporting the cows, supporting the people that are caring for them, supporting cow movement, supporting cow support therapy, and all these things. So I'd love to talk to you all a little bit about that. And then finally, just some veterinary perspectives. I know that Dr. Russo also shared some really, really prescient perspectives. And what I'd love to do is just continue to expand on that, what we've learned, and the questions that we continue to ask from the field. So I have to always show this slide because I don't want to upset people. I am going to show photos of sick cows and sick human beings. So if you feel like that might upset you for any reason, feel free to log out for the next few minutes. I just wanted to give everybody a warning. What I'm going to show could be considered sensitive. So first of all, one of the guiding principles, kind of our North Star on farm that we use, is the pasteurized milk ordinance. And this essentially is a guidance document from the FDA that helps us to determine whether or not milk is saleable, right? So we're talking about grade A dairies here that are inspected and permitted to sell milk to the public. And so when we think about this, we'll call it the PMO, right? The pasteurized milk ordinance. When we think about the PMO, there are certain sections of it that kind of outline from an operational standpoint, how do we manage milk from individual cows? So what the PMO basically says is that the definition of abnormal milk, right, is milk that's visibly changed in color, odor, or texture. And so what I'm showing here in these two images, normally, as you all know, when you're buying milk or seeing milk in the store, right, beautiful creamy white milk, right? And the milk, especially on the bottom left picture here, is more of like a creamier yellow secretion. It almost looks like colostrum, or the first milk that a cow produces, or the first secretion that the cow produces after she has a baby. And on the right here, you can see as one of the processes we take in the milking parlor, right, is screening cows for abnormal milk before the milking unit is attached to them. So this milk here on the bottom right-hand corner also represents milk that we saw when cows were clinically sick here, right? So we've got milk that's got what we would call flakes, clots, it's yellow colored. And normally when you spray a stream of milk onto a hard surface, and makes a nice little puddle, and you can see it splattered. It almost makes these little cheesy spots. So these two both, right, are detected in the parlor, and that's the first place for some of the farms that I work with. This is the first place they noticed something was wrong, was the screening process that we normally do. I like to show this next video. I have a colleague with me in this video, although you can't see his face, sadly. This is Dr. Fabio Texiera. We're doing some quarter level milk samples in this video. And all that means, right, is we're just taking a sample from each representative quarter of the cow. These were clinically affected cows, actually in New Mexico. And you can see the consistency of this milk. I hope this video is playing for y'all. It almost looks like Elmer's glue, right? So as she begins, essentially, one of the other clinical signs, I'll show you more pictures of this, is these cows start to dry themselves off. So decrease their milk production, and the milk texture, the milk consistency, again, thinking about the PMO, the pasteurized milk ordinance, this is what some of these samples look like, especially if her production had decreased significantly. So I wanted to show this picture just to illustrate, again, from the farm perspective. These are the phone calls I was getting, all of us were getting here in this part of the world. There's probably about 10 of us that were really working this case in this geography in February, March, and April. So on the left-hand side is just a picture from the internet of a nice normal cow, right? Beautiful, full udder, all 4 quarters are full. And then if you look here at these 2 cows on the right, one's a Holstein crossbred, one's a Jersey. These girls' udders almost appear like a deflated balloon, right? So you start to see as milk production drops, these udders sort of like start to collapse on themselves. So the mammary tissue, right, is fairly dense, but also it fills up quite a bit with milk. So when she loses milk production, it really, really shows. And this happens normally, right, as she would naturally wean her calf, right, or as she is preparing for the next lactation. This happens normally. But these girls were not anywhere near close to that stage of their lactation. They were early and mid lactation cows. And you can also appreciate here on these 2 pictures on the right-hand side, these girls have chalk marks. It's actually livestock chalk marks on their legs. So a pink mark here on this Holstein and a green mark on this Jersey. That's just another way that we were identifying, right, these girls in the parlor You can use leg bands, you can use flagging tape, all kinds of methods. Hey, something's wrong and we need to take a look at her. Another clinical sign that was, for us, this was more of a subdued sign. Dr. Lombard's going to talk a little bit more about how he observed this sign more severely in other dairies in Texas and in New Mexico, are cows that are have excessive nasal discharge. And on farm, the folks that I work with would call them the drooling cows. They'd say, "What's wrong with these cows? Like they look like they're drooling. They're blowing bubbles." This cow here on the left almost looks like she is about to blow some bubbles. And then, of course, this girl here on the right, she's just depressed, right? She's sad, as they would, most of my folks, we tend to at times associate human emotions. But yeah, when you don't feel good, right? You're depressed. You don't feel like eating. Your ears are drooped. Your eyes are recessed. Your neck and head will hang lower as a cow. So these are just two images that show what clinical cows' heads and faces look like. This is quite an interesting lesion that was observed in a couple different dairies. One of the farms I work with, the folks that regularly treat sick cows every day pulled me aside and they said, "Hey, I have to show you something." And he prepared, you can see this is in the dark, this is illuminated. It's like 5 a.m. He's like, "I have to show you something." So he parts obviously this is the tail of the cow. This is the cow's vulva. And we artificially inseminate these cows. And this is a normal process, right, to inseminate. And he said, "Look at the inside of the vestibule of this vagina. Look at all these vessels that are popping out, and look at not only the pale color, but also kind of, if you can appreciate this, it has almost like a slight yellowish cast to it, almost like the vessels are leaking." And his name's Juan. And Juan's comment to me was, "We see this in cows when they have ticks. Have we checked for ticks?" He knows we're checking for all these things. "Have we checked for ticks?" Right. So then we go on a tick check. But vasculitis is something that we appreciated here at the time cows were clinical, mostly in either the vaginal vestibule or in this right-hand side picture here of this girl's nasoplanum, inside the nares, right, inside the nose. Normally a nose of a cow, if she's a Holstein or a light, has a pink flesh on her nose, it's really nice and pink here, right? And you can appreciate here on this ventral bottom aspect, those vessels are just popping. They look like they're about to bleed. We didn't have any bleeding noses, but Dr. Lombard, I believe, is going to show you some that were. Another thing that we observe clinically is a change in consistency of manure. So as these cows began to not feel well, their rumination time, right? So how much time the rumen normally contracts about once a minute, right? So approximately 500-ish minutes a day. So as their rumination time drops, they're eating, but they're not digesting their feed very well. So what you end up with, this is my hand here in a palpation sleeve, what you end up with is a bunch of manure that's like a bunch of fiber. Normally it looks kind of more like this picture on the right hand side here. It looks like almost the consistency of oatmeal, but really firm manure, almost with mucus, and it had a very distinct smell, almost a smell that we associate with cows specifically that are having digestive problems. Again, while we're checking the back end of the cow, something that we observed here were early in the disease process, very high temperatures, hot fevers in these girls, right? So the normal temperature of an adult cow is like 101 Fahrenheit to about 102.5. And these girls, we got different thermometers several times because we kept thinking that, something's wrong. The thermometer just must be broken, right? And I've gotten reports now from colleagues in California and photos from their situation, which is absolutely devastating, of fevers of 107 and 108 degrees Fahrenheit in the heat stress on sick cows. So these, again, are kind of help to build out the clinical picture for us is a fever. And then this, I'm hoping this is playing for you. This is a cow I saw here in Texas that on the right-hand side, that's my hand, and I'm just palpating along her spine and along her hip there. There is air under the skin, right? We call this subcutaneous emphysema. And all that is saying, okay, normally air is contained, obviously, right above your diaphragm, in your lungs, and coming in and out through your nose and mouth, right? So when air is present in a location that it doesn't belong, we have concerns that she has secondary pneumonia. And unfortunately, some of these girls that we saw clinically did not improve, and we elected to euthanize them. So really, really quickly, thinking again about how do we support these girls that are affected. So the first one, of course, is just making an effort, like we always do when we have cattle that are sick, is to decrease the external stress they face, right? Clean, dry, and comfortable. It's one of my manager's favorite sayings. Make sure these girls are as comfortable as you can possibly make them. And again, shade, right? Well, I should have put shade in there, but that's shade as well, right? For our sunshine states and days. And something else we did here was we temporarily decreased their visits to the milking parlor. So we essentially reduced the frequency that we milk these girls. Number one, to try to reduce stress on them. And secondly, because some of them truly were not making a lot of milk at the time they were clinically sick. The second being one, I know we're talking a lot about rumination, but just supporting that rumen, right? So number one thing we're always striving for is fresh feed that's pushed up often. So most times, right, cows have feed is mixed and delivered to them early in the morning. And then they have another one or two deliveries of fresh feed every day. And sometimes, pretty often, actually, more than not, they're in a pen that they're obviously trying to keep cows in the pen and keep the feed in a clean spot. So those girls are reaching to eat it. So we make sure that we bring the feed to the cows. So one, they can access it. And secondly, they're not having to strain to reach it. So placing the feed, close to those girls. But also what we observed here was we had girls that were reaching and eating straw bales. So we use here in the wintertime straw bales as north windbreaks, and they were just reaching through and eating it. So we have a lot of open lot dairies here, so open corrals. We just started putting hay bales inside the pens and letting them munch on that, right? Let them buffer, let them chew, let their saliva go where it's intended. And then, of course, working together with your nutritionist and your manager and your feeders, talk about the right things that could support your cattle, right? And these aren't meant to be prescriptive by any sense, just the different things here that we tried when we had sick cattle. So prebiotics, probiotics, yeast, moss, zinc, vitamins, you name it. Third thing, and I know we've had a lot of discussion about this as a profession, is fluid therapy. So one of the big ones, of course, always is fresh, clean water, right? Fresh, clean water access in more than one spot, bringing the water closer to them. If for some reason they are not able to stand, we bring the water to them, bring feed to them. Thinking about girls that are more sick, right, that are more dehydrated, they are going to benefit from oral fluid delivery via a drench, right? So you're providing fluids to her. We call this drenching or pumping. And then correcting any electrolyte imbalances. And you can do that through a number of products on the market. And then finally, just like with us, if we get really dehydrated when we have the flu or we are sick, sometimes we need an IV. So especially in cows, we give them an IV of a small volume of fluid and follow up with fluids by mouth. And then finally, just again, like thinking about us when we have the flu, one of the things that, has been a challenge is just trying to reduce fevers, right? These fevers, at least in this part of the world, were pretty transient as a clinical sign, so short acting early in the disease process, but especially if you throw heat stress on top of that, this is such a challenge. And I have just loads of empathy for anyone that has dealt with this in the heat or is dealing with this now. So just as a reminder there, the label product is a transdermal or IV flunixin per label for treatment of either acute bovine mastitis, which was shown earlier, or acute bovine respiratory disease. And then finally, the only other thing I'll mention here is if you have a secondary disease, you may or may not elect to treat that per your veterinarian's treatment plan. So again, thinking about management support, this is where the rubber hits the road, because this is where things get really, really challenging depending on the number of sick cows you have and how fast those girls get sick. So we've got to be thinking about okay, how we identify cows. Is it in the milking parlor? Is it in the pens or corrals? Do we have technology, or can we use rumination or activity monitors? Who on your team or in your family is responsible for identifying these girls, right? It doesn't matter, right? Is it a milker? Is it someone who treats sick cows, fresh cows, Is it a breeder? Does, you know, who specifically, is it Hertz person is responsible for identifying these girls? Where you're going to house and treat cows is a big deal. Thinking specifically about a client I work with that milks almost 9,000 cows. And in one day, he had essentially over 500 cows that needed to be deviated and be supported. We don't have that. We don't have pen space for that normally, right? Normally on the farm, we've got maybe 1 or 2% of the total adult cow population needs love, needs support. So we have to rearrange pens and make sure we have adequate space. What's our treatment plan, right? Working with our veterinarian, working with our consultants, and just understanding like what is our plan going to be. And then finally, documentation and record keeping, not only because we already do that anyway for our vet client patient relationship on farm records, but also because there is indemnity money available. And then big considerations here are that, you know, Dr. Lombard's going to talk about this, but we now understand that cows shed virus prior to becoming clinically ill. So this, if we had the opportunity to know this here, then we have the opportunity again to protect our people and care for our cows. And I'm going to talk more about the One Health approach and opportunities that veterinarians in the field identify. And then finally, just planning for projected morbidity, right? Number of sick animals we think we will treat, and mortality, right? The number that may die or that we may need to euthanize. So I want to put this in here really quick. This is a veterinarian's oath, and this is what drives us as a profession to use what we do to benefit animal health, animal welfare, and promote public health. And that's this, if you think that the PMO is the North Star for milk, the oath is the North Star for veterinarians. And I think Dr. Russo did a great job of talking about, you know, some of the challenges that we have faced kind of being in the middle, right? We have great relationships with our clients. We love working with them, but this has hands down been one of the most challenging times professionally ever. And I think others that have been through emerging disease outbreaks would say the same thing. So again, I'm here speaking with sympathy and with empathy for all my vet colleagues. So let's wrap up here with what we've learned and what we continue to ask as colleagues. So we now thankfully know what the causative agent is, and Dr. Russo did a great job. We understand how it behaves in poultry. It's way different than us on the cattle side. We understand that the mammary gland has receptors for this virus, and milk, cow movement, right? Cow movement is responsible for approximately half of the ways that this virus has been transferred herd to herd. So that's from a paper from Dr. Eric Burrow. Genetically, strains in, if I understand, and I have not spent a lot of time looking at the genetics and the differences in these strains, so I will just touch on this very briefly. Strains in Texas, Kansas, and Michigan from the initial outbreak are very similar genetically. So again, Dr. Russo talked about this. It's B313 that we're seeing on dairy farms. And the California outbreak, this might even be outdated now, but sequencing had shown initially some reassortment of strains and potentially some pieces from Idaho and Michigan. And then we in the field, the challenge here is in the absence of testing, when something is happening clinically, right? And you see clinical signs and you test for normal pathogens and you kind of come up empty-handed. This is what kind of got us in the sauce in the first place, right? We saw signs here in all classes of cattle on the farm that we just didn't know, and we don't quite understand what was going on, right? In terms of GI disease, respiratory disease, and even things that changes we saw, ocular changes, right? So we now know, we hypothesize that there's a respiratory component because there are receptors in the type 2 pneumocytes of the bronchus and lung, and receptors as well in the cerebrum. This is from a paper that Dr. Richard Webby from St. Jude's helped to co-author. They basically looked at banked tissues from beef and dairy cattle both, and identified whether or not these receptors were present with a stain. So again, I know this is a really tenuous topic because there's so many questions, right, about dry cows, about calves, about heifers. We anecdotally here saw that dry cows, if all the herd had rumination collars, dry cows had the same transient dip in rumination minutes when the cows did. And again, calves and heifers, it's the time of the year when the weather for us is changing a lot. We have drastic temperature changes. The ambient temperature outside was still in the 50s and 60s, but you just wonder like, hey, there's more respiratory disease, or we have pink eye right now, and that's strange because we tend to have more pink eye when we have flies, things like that, right? Questions that you would ask out of curiosity. And so there's been some recent research that helps shed some light on this. And this is from Dr. Amy Baker's group at the USDA. And that was just literally published like a week ago. So it was a cow and heifer study. So they inoculated Holstein heifers with a mask and observed outcomes. So they did demonstrate mild clinical disease, thinking about the respiratory signs that we talked about earlier. And then they did confirm infection with H5N1 by PCR, lesions in the lung, and seroconversion. And of course, that just means seroconversion is the process, just like when we are either exposed to something or we're vaccinated, we begin to produce antibodies specific to that virus. And so then Arizona as well, this is very recent. Arizona recently released a director's administrative order on the 17th of October that basically mandates that non-lactating dairy cattle of any age have to test negative on nasal swabs prior to entry. So essentially, it's very similar to kind of how the federal order is structured. So test 30 head individually if you have a group bigger than 30, test your whole group if you have less, do an influenza A PCR test on them at a NAHLN lab, right? And the results are valid for 7 days. So Arizona also in this administrative order suggested that these cattle have a 21-day quarantine when they arrive in Arizona. And then finally, there's a section at the end that talks about exemptions, including direct to slaughter and terminal feedlots or feed yards. And again, I think a lot of us are familiar with the federal order, but just as a reminder, we basically, if a lactating cow moves across state lines, she has to be tested. If it's a group bigger than 30, just 30 individual milks have to be taken that represent all 4 quarters. The only exception here would be, of course, herds that are on voluntary monitoring programs. That's a state level decision if they exempt you from doing that or not. You have to collect that milk and test, a week before you're going to move. And those results are good just for a week. And then if you're positive, you basically are going to get a 30-day timeout. You're going to not be able to move cows interstate, so across state lines for a month. And then herd owners and those who have cattle who test positive, in this order, the ask is that you provide, information about your herd and about how you move animals for tracing. And then clinical lactating dairy cattle are ineligible for moving across state lines or moving to slaughter to beef. And then just a reminder about reporting, of course, private labs, vets, the state labs, which are the non-labs, and state vets report to APHIS. So this includes both PCR, milk and nasal swabs, and serology. Antibodies have to be, that are positives must be reported. And the challenge here, we'll talk about this here in a minute, but one of the challenges I think that we in the field have faced, and I think Dr. Russo touched on this nicely as well, is because there's hesitancy to face a quarantine, even if a herd is previously reported, they are hesitant to allow us to do serum surveillance, right? So we would love to collect some blood samples, understand what's going on, understand if we have cows now that we suspect, just to understand what the clinical picture is. So that, unfortunately, because of this federal order, it is quite limited at the moment. So something I want to talk about is how the FDA has handled their approach to this outbreak, and they did a great job. Initially, they came right out of the gate and said, "Hey, we have pasteurization studies from other viruses that we can use." They've been building a body of knowledge about pasteurization, and I think it's great, right? They've done milk, they've done some cheeses. They're trying to do other types of soft cheeses and raw milk cheeses, if I understand right. They've done ice cream. So they're really, really doing a good job reassuring everybody, hey, pasteurization inactivates this virus and milk is safe. And so as someone who drinks a lot of milk, that's a relief. But the thing I want to touch on here is the second tenet of the reason that, we believe that milk is safe is because the diversion or destruction of milk from sick cows. And remember, our current detection method for sick cows goes back to the PMO, right? Pasteurized Milk Ordinance. And that is where we use visual cues essentially. And there's also odor cue, but there's visual and different cues that we use. And I think Dr. Pam Rugg said this really well. This is the first time that we have had a virus that has impacted milk in this way. And knowing the things now, I think Dr. Lombard's going to touch on this, is we are not able to divert animals' milk if they are not clinically ill. So they may definitely be shedding virus in their milk and not be clinical, resulting in a big challenge in raw milk in particular, this virus is present on herds that are impacted. So I hope all my veterinary colleagues appreciate this moment here that we're going to have a moment together talking about aspirin. The FDA within the last week and a half released a letter directed towards us about the use of aspirin in cattle and how there are no approved products, and therefore aspirin is not an approved product for us to use on farm. And what's interesting about this is previously the FDA kind of determined this risk was low, the use of aspirin. And yes, it is true. There are no FDA approved products for cattle, no aspirin products that are approved by the FDA. But the challenge here is thinking about, again, back to the pasteurized milk ordinance. If you look at this 15R under drug and chemical control, okay, unapproved drugs shall not be used. But on the inspector side, essentially drugs that are capable of causing a residue, which we understand this, right? One of the challenges with aspirin and with dosing aspirin is that it can cause a residue in milk, which there's zero tolerance for that. And so they cannot be used or stored on the dairy. So technically, historically, milk inspectors could have written up dairies for storing aspirin, and they didn't. And the irony here for us as well as practitioners is the fact that this is an over-the-counter product. So we as a veterinarian, obviously, we can write prescriptions for prescription products. This is a product that historically dairies have been able to purchase and use without a prescription. So this presents a really, really big challenge for us in the field to try to regulate this. I wish that the FDA would go back to the manufacturers and back to distribution on this one, because I feel like that would be a more effective means to work this out. And then my love language is memes. So I just find it ironic that this has become part of this discussion is about aspirin in cattle rather than the challenges that this virus presents in raw milk, essentially everywhere in cattle that have been affected clinically and non-clinically. Just a reminder about One Health, right? Dr. Russo talked about this, but this is us, right? We are in the sauce in the environment with other people we care about, caring for animals that we care about, and the physical and mental and emotional well-being and the toll it's taken on all of us has been really hard. And not just veterinarians, for the owners, for people caring for cattle, for all the uncertainty about what this presents to us. It's been a really big deal. It's just a tremendous challenge. And I think this picture here, this is from the CDC. This is one of the initial cases of humans in Texas, which we now understand we have receptors for this virus in our eyes, which is why we present with this type of reddened conjunctiva and sclera. But man, this is scary stuff. Back from the very beginning, we had sick birds and we had dying birds. we had sick and dying cats, we had sick cattle, and we had sick people. And it's just, it's one of those things that most days you wake up and you think, okay, is this real? Is this really happening? And it is. And we're here now to continue to step up to the challenge. And in that same vein, again, back to the challenges that this faces and how to approach this from a One Health perspective. On the left-hand side here, this is a tag from a cow that has died. And it says in Spanish, this cow died from the virus, right? And it's just thinking about this touches everybody on the farm. And on the right-hand side here is just an image of milk being discarded on an affected farm early in this disease outbreak. And just, it's just terrible, right? We're working really hard to take care of cows and to produce safe milk, cheese, yogurt, ice cream for folks here. So it's really terrible to go through this. Dr. Russo talked about this a little bit, but veterinarians, including myself, have faced some challenges professionally about speaking about this, including being terminated for speaking up, for doing what we think is right for the cow and the human and the environment. So some real final ruminations here, and I will pass the torch. I think the questions that we should be asking are what about healthy cows, right? We're spending a lot of time focusing on sick cows, and by nature, that's kind of where veterinarians have a lot of questions and we love to investigate. But the non-clinical cows that were exposed, we've also got to learn, why didn't they get sick, right? And what is common about these cows that didn't get sick? And the unpredictable variable isn't necessarily what we understand about the virus. It's what we fail to understand about the variability in the immune system and an immune response in populations. You think about this through Spanish flu, COVID-19, and now it's the opportunity for us to learn about our populations of cattle immune system. And not just us, right? Humans, mammals, and birds. And gosh, we have to protect human and animal health. It's been extremely challenging to try to work together and understand some of the agency perspective, right? It just seems that some of the agencies each have their own area of expertise. And if you think about One Health, this is all in, this is all together. It's not just CDC with people. It's not just USDA with animals. It's not just the FDA with milk. It's not just the departments of public health for people. It's all, and it's all hands on deck. And we want to help. And we really feel like at times that we have been minimized. And then finally, this unfortunately is a dress rehearsal for foreign animal disease. And the world is watching us respond to this right now. So with that, I thank you all. I welcome any questions that come in at the end, and I appreciate the opportunity to share with you all today.
Thank you, Dr. Peterson. That was amazing. I appreciate your candor and your openness and all the work you've done. All right, so we will move along. We got a lot going on, so I'm just going to jump right into it with Dr. Jason Lombard.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me on the webinar. I do have a with a little mix, or the change up in the schedule, I have 15 minutes before I board a flight. So I'm going to go a little bit fast through here, if my computer will work. Okay, so just a disclaimer that although I worked for the government for a long time, everything I'm going to say today has nothing to do with the US government. I don't represent them in any way, although some of the data that I will be presenting was made in part by a cooperative agreement with USDA Animal Plant Health Inspection Service. So quick background on HPAI, which you probably already have most of that. We'll talk a little bit about disease spread, clinical signs in cows that Dr. Peterson's already talked about. We'll talk about a little bit in maybe cows that are, or herds that are experiencing chronic illness, and then cow and herd level impacts. So when we talk about influenza, there's 4 types, type A, B, C, and D. A and B are really what we generally think of in humans in terms of seasonal Seasonal influenza type C really doesn't cause epidemics, but that can cause some mild disease. And influenza D is primarily found in cattle, usually doesn't cause clinical signs, and it would be boring if we were talking about influenza D today, and I would be completely happy with that. But it is influenza A that we're talking about, and that's based divided into subtypes, as you've heard, H5N1, based on those two surface proteins, the hemagglutinin and the neuraminidase. And the current outbreak, the H5N1, is referred to as the clade 2.3.44b, genotype B3.313, and that's what we call the cattle genotype. So the current challenge is how is this virus moving from herd to herd? And I think that's the number one question that's still on my mind, because if we can stop it from moving herd to herd, then we can stop this virus. How is the virus moving cow to cow is important too. I think that some of the information that we've got back is that by the time owners start segregating sick cows, it's too late. The cows that are going to be exposed have been exposed, and we really can't stop the disease from moving through a herd once we start seeing clinical signs in cows in that herd. And then, as Dr. Peterson kind of alluded to, are younger cattle and non-lactating cows involved in disease spread? And then is reinfection, relapse, or chronic infection already occurring on farms? And I think we've got some evidence to suggest maybe that is happening. So this was as yesterday, and I think there were maybe some new numbers already, 334 cases in the 14 states to date. So how is bird flu spreading in dairy cows? And this is a CDC graphic. It talks about the wild bird to cow as that being a single time transmission from wild birds to cattle, and ever since then, the genotype that we're seeing of this virus is from that initial cattle spillover. So cow to cow, we're not completely sure how it spread, although with the large amounts of virus in the milk, we think the milk may play a role either through the actual milking process or through aerosolization in the parlor. There could also be some aerosol transmission of the virus as well. Cow to poultry, that's been confirmed in multiple states where we find this genotype in poultry operations, as Dr. Russo mentioned, and at least in some cases we know that that's through either shared workers or shared housing of workers that worked on dairy and poultry. And of course, if we would go back and look at a year ago, we wouldn't think that would necessarily be a risk, but we do see that as a risk today. Cow to cat, probably through the consumption of milk. Cow to human, most likely through the contact of the contaminated virus-containing milk. And then human to human, which at the time this was put together, CDC reported that there was no evidence of that. I think that the Missouri case of the human with no exposure to cattle, no exposure, or at least didn't say they consumed any raw milk or anything like that, suggests maybe there is a human-to-human component to that. I'll also say there's a poultry to cow as well. We've had instances where the genomic sequence shows that it moved from poultry to cattle. We didn't necessarily have the same shared workers or shared housing in that case, and so was it spread via aerosol? I think the one potential case in Michigan suggests that could be a possibility. All right, so known disease risk. So we know lactating cattle are a risk. That's how it moved out of the Southwest into most of the other states. Of course, those cattle were not known to be infected, and those herds were not known to be infected at the time those cattle were moved. And then people, and I think that we saw some images from Dr. Peterson about illness in some of our workers. I think that's a risk of not only the workers, but also our owners moving the disease around. So as far as assumed risk, service personnel and vehicle movements, although some of the work that's been done looking at environmental samples, sampling trucks moving cattle, hasn't really shown a lot of virus that we can detect. Of course, we're there weeks after the disease was brought onto the operation. As far as assumed low risk feces, we found it, as far as I know, we found it in one fecal sample out of the hundreds or thousands that have been sampled. There could be a potential for it to be in manure, which is really the combination of feces and urine, because we do find it in somewhere between 5 and 15% of samples of urine in sick cattle. And then low risk milk trucks, we did a sampling of trucks in Michigan, at least 126 samples. There was one sample that was positive out of that, so we deemed that really as a low risk. Migratory waterfowl, until this Washington herd or Washington poultry flock broke, all of the commercial poultry this year had been with the B313, the cattle genotype. So it looks like Washington might actually be exposure to migratory waterfowl. Peri-domestic birds, the Wildlife Services has done a lot of testing of birds. Again, 2 to 3 weeks after the onset of clinical signs, they find a fairly small percentage of those birds that have the virus, and the majority of those appear to be spillover from the cattle as opposed to a risk of transmission to the cattle. So this is a cow that was picked out by this operation on the morning that we took these pictures, and as Dr. Peterson noted, she's got her head down, she's got her ears kind of down as well. She does have this serous nasal discharge, so clear discharge coming out of both nostrils. And if you take her temperature, pulse, respiration, she'd probably be pretty normal. But when you look at her, maybe listen to her rumen, you can tell something's wrong with her. So as we started doing testing, and that's what we did, was a lot of serial testing in herds, we started to see we saw a lot of different signs. And I think that's one of the things that this disease seems to have a different presentation almost on every farm that we go to, and a lot of times a different presentation in the cows. So this was a cow that actually did have a bloody nose, whether that's a primary pneumonia or something more upper respiratory, I don't know, but she was euthanized soon after that. All right, so the cow on the right is a cow that this is in a herd that's probably 2 to 2.5 months, was not feeling serious, but did have some bloody nasal discharge as well. And as we started working with some of these herds that have had not only some that had chronic 2 to 3 months of slow trickle of sick cows, but some of them that appeared to have really low incidence initially. When we started going back, they started having some nasal discharge, which really leads me to think that there is a respiratory component to this disease that we still haven't really figured out yet. And as you look at this picture on the right that's taken in a milking parlor, and this looks like saliva that's dripping down from all these cows, but it actually isn't. It's nasal discharge. And I would say that 30 to 40% of this herd had nasal discharge. Just some more pictures of nasal discharge in cows. Here again, the one on the right has a little bit of blood in hers again. The cow on the left here is really salivating quite a bit. This was a cow that was locked up in the stanchion as we were taking the samples, and within a minute she had a puddle of saliva on the feed. And if that was early on and had a lot of virus in it, that could be a way the disease is spread as well. And then this cow on the right, just a lot of feed, of course, digging through the feed, but also has that mucopurulent nasal discharge as well. So this is some epidemic curves from 4 dairies, and I think that the bottom line is it's a little bit variable, but if we look at it, it looks like most of the time the majority of cases are detected out by 10 to 14 days, and by 21 to 30 days they're pretty much through the outbreak. So if we look up here, Farm A had 22% of their cows have disease, and we saw that fluctuate from about 7% in Farm K to 22% in Farm A. And then the duration of seeing clinical signs ranged from 16 to 38 days. Farm K had some resource issues, and they had to move a bunch of cows into lactating pens, and that's why we see that big jump where they moved over 400 cows on that one day, just so that they could manage in one place. This is information from an individual cow, so some measurements of rumination, which is in the orange. And this cow was ruminating at about 500 minutes per day, and then dropped off to about 50 minutes per day at the kind of the peak of her decreased rumination. And then the blue represents her milk production, which she'd been milking about 100 pounds per day. That dropped to about 15 pounds per day, and then came back to about 70 pounds, which is what more analyses have showed that those cows tend to lose about 30% off their lactation curve after they go through a bout of bird flu. So we've been looking at shedding over time, and these are just the dates up here that we've collected samples. We're missing, we still have a lot of testing to get completed, but the red bars essentially show that these cows are shedding, and we have periods where, such as this 1173 here, she's shedding for 4 periods, and then we don't detect it in 1 period, and then she's shedding again at the next period. I think the one other interesting thing about this is that the bulk tank was negative on August 5th and remained negative on this farm. We were finding a few cows shedding, albeit at very, very low levels of virus, high CT levels. And at least a few of these cows were in the sick pen at the time, so they wouldn't have been included in the bulk tank that was being tested. Looking at just individual cows for shedding, this first cow, she was the short bars represent when samples were collected but negative. And you can see this cow was only shedding in milk. She had a CT value of 10, which is a large amount of virus, and then very quickly went up to above 30, which is a lot lower amount of virus, log decrease in virus over time. So just in milk, no nasal swab, urine, or feces. This next cow here, she was positive on nasal swab on the very first sample that was collected, and then negative on nasal swab, positive on every milk sample that was collected over that time frame. This third cow, kind of interesting, she was positive on nasal swab 3 times, which is the only cow I know of that's been positive on nasal swab that many times, and then was only positive on milk once, which is pretty unusual too. So again, a lot of variation in what we see in terms of shedding. This fourth cow, she was positive on milk at every sample and positive on urine on 1 sample. And then this cow was, and all these are clinical cows, was only positive on urine, but positive 3 times, not positive on milk during at least the time we were sampling. So I think my main point is we see a lot of variation in shedding and some change and some differences in the length of shedding as well. So I just want to go through some quick cow level impacts from Farm A. 22% of their cows ended up being sick out of 3,600. And when we look at 6 months later, what we're seeing in terms of those about 800 cows, 50% of those remain in the herd. 2.5% are essentially not going to be bred back. They had 8.5% mortality, and 40% were sold. And Dr. Russo mentioned about a 4%. I think that we see a lot of variation in mortality, case fatality rate of cows that got sick, from essentially 0% on some farms up to 15% on others. So it's a pretty wide range of case fatality. So we wanted to look at impacts on future milk production, because we did hear on those experimentally infected cows that we did see scar tissue in the mammary gland. So we had one farm A here that had disease early on, and they've had cows that went through the dry period and now are freshening back and lactating. And if we look at days in milk cutoff, as we get further out, so we get to 90 days in milk, the projections that we're going to get for that lactation are much better than they are at 60 days. We only had 37 cows that reached that 90-day milk cutoff. We really didn't see any change in peak milk at that level. When we look at projected 305-day milk in terms of pounds, we saw between 800 and 1,000 pounds less milk in their projected 305-day production. And the thing is that this is based on, we used cows as their own control. So how did they do in the lactation that they got sick versus the lactation that they're in now? And generally, we would see an increase in milk production in the next lactation. So this is actually a decrease when we would expect a little bit of an increase. And then the biggest one that I think we saw that the change in, about a 10% decrease, was change in mature equivalent 305 milk, about 3,000 pounds, which is about a 10 to 11% decrease over their previous lactation. And so this is a small number of cows, one farm. I'm not going to make a lot of projections based on that, but this is at least what we're seeing initially. So for some herd level changes, this is some work that was done out of Iowa State on a herd that had some banked bulk tank milk samples, and what they found was they started seeing virus at about 19 days before the onset of clinical signs. And at that time, if we'd have tested them, they'd have been PCR negative and ELISA negative. And then the amount of virus really peaked at about 5 days after the onset of clinical signs. And then we started seeing the CT values start going up, meaning lower amounts of virus. So we can take different sections of this and say, okay, well, these animals, if we do the PCR and ELISA, we can tell which stage they're in for these. Okay. So at about 30 days, we start seeing, for the most part, those herds start becoming very close to being PCR negative, but we did see the virus present in the bulk tank milk at least 2 weeks prior to the onset of clinical signs. We had 4 herds that had bulk tank samples that were collected immediately after having clinical signs. And so when we plot those, we see the same kind of scenario where if you consider 40 as essentially not detectable, we see that at about 30 days. But in some of these herds where we followed them out over 100 days, we could get little detections of virus at about 97 days. So as we saw a lot of variation in terms of the shedding at the individual cow, it makes sense that we'd kind of reflect some of that in the bulk tank as well. So just 2 graphs left, and that's the impact on somatic cell counts and milk production. This is a herd that had a very small impact, 16% increase in somatic cell count, 6% decrease in daily milk per day, pretty mild change to what we considered their baseline for 30 days prior. As opposed to this herd where we saw 126% increase in their bulk tank somatic cell counts, more than doubling, and a 15% decrease in milk production at their lowest level. So that's really all I had today. I will try to jump back on, but I really appreciate the time to present today. And
all right, so here's some Q&A that was submitted prior to, and then this last one during the webinar. So the first one was, what has been the protocol for handling dead animals? We answered a little bit in there. That'll depend on the municipality and what's actually permitted. Some states allow composting, some don't. I'll let you talk to this or expand on this, Barb, and maybe Kay, as far as how they handle chickens, right? So in poultry, how they compost them and the challenges of and the risk of moving cows. Also would like to hear more about the risk of not composting and just allowing them to be there waiting for rendering, and the risk that might pose to wildlife, other, shall we say, vermin who are coming around to those mortality areas for that. So could you talk a little bit about that, Barb, and Dr. Kay, while John and I get his presentation sorted out?
Yeah, absolutely. I can start. So Texas, I'll speak to Texas because this is the part of the world where I spend most of the time in. Texas allows for disposal by rendering, composting, and burial. And ideally, right, there was an interesting article that came out that reminds everybody that rendering is one of the most effective methods, right, because that inactivates the virus as well. In the state of Texas, Texas Animal Health Commission at the time didn't change any of our rules about handling dead cattle. But I think it will be wise for all of us to think about if we leave an animal in a spot where we've had now transmission in wild mammals. We've seen here mice and skunks and foxes and raccoons and all other types of small mammals. If it's in the environment, we just need to be conscientious about how we are handling it. And arrange for animals to be placed in a site away from other animals and in a way that they can be easily picked up by your rendering truck without having to come on your farm if at all possible. And we also here have, a lot of folks have these, just a place to respectfully keep animals that have died. It almost looks like a corral, a pen of its own. And that way animals are placed in there and there's a gate that closes and then the rendering truck can open it and pick them up.
Yeah, I think traditionally in the past on the dairies, and Barb can probably speak to this as well, we've tended to place the animals kind of out of public sight for that reason, because it isn't the best thing to look at. But California dairies are unable to do any sort of on-farm burial or composting, is my understanding, according to regulations. So, as the rendering trucks are trying to keep up, there are images that are reaching, popular press showing cows basically being left on the side of the road. And part of that is because they're trying to pull those animals away from where the rendering truck is and having to drive onto the operation, which could increase risk of spread. And so, unfortunately, it's being met with kind of a lot of blowback. But in the poultry space, it's really dependent on the barn type. There's a lot of composting that takes place, but with some layer facilities, you can't do indoor composting. You have to do outdoor composting. And so that's a very well prescribed method of composting birds in such a way that it doesn't increase risk for a spillover into other species. Obviously, avian flu, it can be quite virulent to birds. We're seeing a lot of birds of prey like eagles and other things that consume carcasses that are getting hit with this virus. So outside of that, landfilling, and it depends, some landfills will not accept carcasses from HPAI outbreaks. Incineration is also an option, but I think you see a lot of composting across the U.S. with these large bird outbreaks more often than not.
Awesome. Thanks, Barb. Yeah, I'm hoping they adapt some things so folks can compost on site and avoid quickly get those under control and buried and avoid that contamination. I think, Barb, you mentioned again the visibility. I've always recommended that folks create a mortality area that actually has a cover to it as well to decrease the chances of birds getting in, also decrease the chance, just the unsightliness of it all. But I think the ability to compost would be ideal. Next question, are we seeing any long-term damage to udder performance or performance in affected animals? Do we think these animals are at higher risk of other diseases? Dr. Jason kind of touched on that a little bit about what we're seeing in this variability of recovery, right? I don't know. I think there's just a lot to be learned from there. Barb, I don't know if you have anything to add to what Dr. Lombard had shared with that.
Just that there's now been 2 different research publications that demonstrate there's, fibrosis in the udder, right? So there's damage to the udder tissue. And then again, here anecdotally and with data both, some herds were more severely impacted than others. Some herds' milk production resumed more so and more quickly than others did. So I just think, yeah, there's a lot of variability. And the risk, I think, is there for anytime if you have a challenge to your immune system, you unfortunately also are going to have a higher risk for comorbidities, right? Other diseases that can happen, like mastitis. So going forward, that's a great question. We have timer's going to tell us here.
Awesome. Great. One more question and then I'll get John's thing pulled up here if it'll let me, because it's now asking me questions. This is the DZ given the news this morning. What is the likelihood of H5N1 in dairy cattle becoming a concern in Canada now that it's appearing again in commercial poultry there? Has the threat been greatly heightened? Dr. K, I might let you touch on that. You know more about chickens. I don't know about your bandwidth across Canada, but
I would say ultimately we've seen a couple of farms that are coming up positive in British Columbia, as I understand it. There has been no data released as to the genotype of the virus that's affecting those operations. It's important to bear in mind that right now is when we start to see movement of migratory birds. And so in the fall and the spring is when we tend to see spillover from wild birds into our commercial flocks. And so we're seeing some confounding or exacerbation of spillover events between the migratory birds and then also the dairy genotype that's applying pressure. So it's to be determined. Most of the birds are moving north to south at this point. So hopefully they won't be carrying it north right now. And again, there's been no indication based on wild bird sampling that they are carrying this B313 genotype yet, but folks are looking for it. So I think you need to stay vigilant. And I think the key to this, where we sort of saw a breakdown with this outbreak, is the lack of communication across different ag species. So the dairies weren't necessarily communicating with the poultry when they were hit, and then the poultry were sort of sitting ducks. And so I hope if it does hit Canada, there's a better collaboration with not only the governmental entities, but also across the different ag sectors.
Awesome. Thank you very much. I'm asking Dr. John to send the actual PowerPoint because the Adobe doesn't want to open. So we'll keep going with questions. I'm going to jump to the dry cows because I think Barb, you had mentioned again that we had there was this initial, I think part of my frustration was early on the story kept changing about where was it? Was it in cats? Was it in birds? Like, oh, yep, there was. It's only lactating cows. We're seeing it now. We're seeing it that it can be in other age groups. What about the dry cows? Also, what about do we have a sense, or have you been working with any farms that had it? And now, at that early development phase, if it has this propensity or predilection for the udder, we know that heat stress impacts the development of the udder and the mammary gland, right? And that impacts lasts through their whole entire lifetime. Are you seeing any reports at all? And I realize it'd really be hard to really know for sure, but potential, these springers or breeding age heifers that were on these farms at that time, not necessarily showing up like we would have expected them to, if that makes sense. Any sense about that or experience around that?
Yeah, great question. Two pieces of data I think that help at least shed light on what's going on is the first one is cows with individual rumen monitoring devices, right? So cows with collars, kind of like we talked about. Those girls, of course, did show the same dip, and some, we track that because we track feed intake and feed that's consumed every day and what's refused, right? What's not eaten. And it was not as severe as the lactating cows, but there were declines in transiently, right? For 1 day, 2 days, 3 days max, right? For those girls. So that, as well as some of the signs that we saw, of course, that we still don't quite understand, right? In younger animals. That also is a question for us. And secondly, of course, is some of the research that is being worked on right now that I believe will be reported soon about some of the seroprevalence, right? That we've gone through now, and there has been some herds that have allowed us to bleed some cows. So we're showing, hopefully going to be able to demonstrate that those girls did seroconvert.
Thank you. Anything else to add to that, Kate? Don't want to miss an opportunity for you to share.
I would say, we are getting signaled that, as Barb alluded to, that these animals are perhaps getting infected with the virus, albeit it may be lesser numbers of them, because the transmission, if it's not, as efficient as the major form of transmission, which we still have yet to elucidate what that is, we're seeing less numbers of animals seroconvert. But the question remains as to whether those animals are a risk for onward transmission to other cattle, poultry, wildlife. We don't know that yet. And so it's very difficult to say, what the meaning is of it until we better define it and look at these populations a bit closer. And they might provide negligible risk, right? But we need to look at it.
Awesome.
And
Thanks.
one other really quick follow-up is herds that are on voluntary monitoring programs. So I work with some herds that they get enrolled by your state, right? So you agree that you're going to test all your cows via a bulk tank samples, right? So it's weekly bulk tank, fresh cows, hospital cows. You get 3 weeks in a row of negative tests, and then you maintain it by continuing to sample. So I work with herds that some of them, they have all their cows calving at one location. So imagine you have one farm and then you have like 2 or 3 sister farms, right? And sometimes they're down the road from each other, and sometimes geographically they're not close to each other. But in this example with a client of mine, the 2 locations that we freshen animals at those those bulk tanks consistently have not always tested negative, if that makes sense. We've continued to have PCR positives in the bulk tank, albeit they're at higher CT values, so lesser amounts of viral RNA. But the question here for us is which girls are popping those tanks, right? Is it fresh heifers? Is it dry cows for some reason that didn't respond? Is it any number of those things? Is it lactating cows that for some reason didn't respond? So I'm looking forward to digging in a little bit deeper on that also.
Awesome. Which I think highly, if Jason could have stayed on, kind of this broader appeal to folks to help support the testing, right? For people to step up and volunteer testing, to try to be those farms that start testing before you're positive, so we can see what's happening, so we can see the change, so we know. I think why I've relied so heavily on y'all is that we just don't know. There's so much we don't know, so it's really hard to plan some of these things and figure out the best practice when folks ask us, how should I manage biosecurity? How should I worry about that? Should I worry about the route breeder? I'm assuming you should. Should I worry about the hoof trimmer? I'm assuming you should, right? So there's just so much we don't know. And part of that is just this lack of visibility. And maybe onto that next one, as I'm still, and John, I'm hoping we can get your things sorted out. The PDF doesn't want to work, but if you can get the PowerPoint to me, I think we can work on that. Certainly feel free to open it up and have your input on this as well. On that question, as far as the evolving nature of HPAI and its impact on other poultry operations. And so, Kay, what are you hearing at your end of the barn on the poultry side about proactive action around enhanced early detection, biosecurity compliance, and really that response? I heard someone today say, when I was worried about the Canadian one, they're like, I bet it's not the cow because people have gotten lax on biosecurity. They haven't had, HPAI in Canada for a while and people were slipping. We've heard the same thing before on the pig side of things, right? Where, the one thing they found was that people were, we seem to figure it out. So we, start slipping a little bit on biosecurity. What are you hearing, or what are you aware of that on the poultry side they're trying to do to kind of ramp that up for advanced detection, or even, refreshing that?
So a couple things to that end. I mean, on the poultry side in the United States, the biosecurity is pretty superior, right? I mean, they've been dealing with repeated outbreaks of high path, one severe one in 2014, 2015. The most recent outbreak started in 2022, was just exacerbated with the additional host being cattle. And so many of these operations have fairly tight biosecurity. So when I go to visit, I've got to sign paperwork that I haven't been in an operation for X amount of days prior. They've now included cattle into that, where I'm not to be around cattle before I go on site. And so there's a lot of these, this tightening, right? But there's even shower-in facilities that are getting hit with the B313 genotype. And so that suggests an alternative method of transmission, whether that's shared workers, which was one of the risk factors identified here in Colorado, between, dairy farms and the poultry outbreak, which was a shower-in facility. But also there's this concept or concern that there might be some airborne component of this as well. I mean, when these cows get sick, their milk contains a lot of virus. And so if that virus were to somehow become airborne on dust or odoriferous compounds, then that could be a risk factor as well. And to the point where the operation here in Colorado is considering filtering air coming in. And so, ultimately, the NPIP has 14 steps in biosecurity that every poultry operation should be aware of and implement. So that's kind of a nice way to look at and translate over to the dairy side. But I'd say in the US, I can't speak for Canada because I'm truly not up there ever. The US, I think the biosecurity is fairly tight at this point, and it's still getting into these facilities.
Awesome. Thank you, Kay. And John, it looks like you're able to share your PowerPoint. Maybe not the view we want. We're seeing your presenter view, so we're seeing your next slide. But hey, I'm going to take what I can get. I'm not going to get greedy because I just want to hear what John has to share. So John, if you can come off mute, you can go ahead and pick it up, and we'd love to hear what you have to share. Only Now we're seeing something else.
Okay, am I off mute now?
You're off mute, but now we're seeing your email or something. I don't know what
Yep.
we're looking at.
Okay, we'll get back on to full view here if we can. Slideshow
There.
from the beginning. Are we back on the slideshow?
You are. We're good enough.
Okay, hallelujah. I'm
Close enough for government work, as they say.
This old dog is a tough time with tricks anymore, but we'll get going here. Anyway,
You're
I
up.
want to talk a little bit about what I think my working hypotheses are right now with this virus, just based on, I haven't been on cow farms like Jason and his crews, or Barb, of course, who's there all the time. But what I could read, what I've seen, what I hear, I think this, and what my experiences have been with this virus particularly in pigs, that's where my where my wheelhouse is. And watching this thing back when I raised pigs many, many years ago, and then listening to a lot of presentations and so on in my years with USDA, and also going to a lot of swine meetings. I think this virus is a lot more like a respiratory virus in pigs and chickens than we initially gave it credit for in the dairy industry. And I think it's highly infectious, highly transmissible via area spread, based on what epidemiological observations that I've been able to see. It spreads to other cattle herds and spreads to other species, probably by area spread. We're going to cover that a little bit more as we go through here. The slides. It definitely spreads to other species, and it spreads extremely fast. As we were going through the outbreak in Colorado this summer, even in Texas last winter, where we probably didn't find nearly all the herds that were infected. Idaho's had widespread spread in a lot of herds pretty darn fast. Michigan had pretty rapid spread. In my mind, these occurred at rates of speed that were incompatible with the mechanical type of spread that we talked about, that we tried to tell ourselves that this was occurring through fomites and those type of things, and it just doesn't fit that kind of an epidemiological picture in my mind. I think it's probably an oral nasal route of infection. It's pretty hard for me to picture that we can move virus from farm to farm through a lactational route at the rate of speed that this virus is spread from herd to herd. Oral nasal fits the route a lot better, or fits the picture a lot better. I'm not sure that we know exactly where the receptors are. It could it be the tonsils? Could it be in the nose? Who knows? I don't think that's been settled for sure. But the later work now from ARS showing that the bucket calves can be infected, actually pretty easily drinking infected milk, which of course is a very high viral titer, would indicate that orally they can be infect bucket calves with infected milk. They know they show they can infect earlier. They can infect the yearling heifers with the intranasal route. So somewhere in the head, there are receptors, and the virus can be spread by that route. We know the virus is shed oral nasally. Maybe not at levels in BLC L3 labs that seem quite real promising, but apparently it can be shed. We know it's shed at high levels in milk. The question I would ask is, what's it take to get it aerosolized up from milk at levels that are high enough that it can be picked up then again through the oral nasal route? Same way with urine. Semen, I think, is yet to be determined, and that's probably an area that needs some study. If this virus gets into the bloodstream and passes through the body to the point where it can infect the central nervous system, it's, at least to some degree, it obviously infects the udder. I think longer term, the industry needs to understand whether semen is a possibility for infection. And then if it is, of course, then that's an area that the cattle studs will need to be aware of to do some testing and monitoring. Systemic pathology, obviously, we already know it affects the upper respiratory tract in different areas, including possibly the lungs, central nervous system. It has to get into the kidneys one way or another if it's passed out in the urine. It gets into the udder. I think there may be a difference between passing through the udder and getting into the milk as early as 16 days pre clinical signs versus actually dropping into the udder tissue itself and causing the mastitis. I think there's probably two different things that happen there. I'm not a udder physiologist by any means, but we have cows that are shedding virus and yet never get mastitis, and we have cows that get mastitis. So maybe there's two different mechanisms, or one extension of another, the extension of a mechanism that causes the mastitis in certain cows and certain quarters. But I think it seems like when we have PCR levels in milk very, very early prior to clinical infection, that there has to be something going on systemically in the cows before the mastitis actually sets up in the proportion of the cows later on down the clinical picture in the herd. Barb talks a lot about vascular endothelium being attacked. I think that's a very promising area for research that I'd like to see more work done on. When we have this huge fluid loss that in these cows, they have to be treated with a lot of dosing of oral fluids. Where's that fluid going? Where's it being lost? Obviously, they get better when they get fluids, a lot of nursing care, but why is that fluid? How is that fluid going away? Are they just not drinking fluids? They're not feeling good enough to drink, or is there a lot of fluid compartment loss? I think we need some good basic research in body pathology or pathology of the vascular system to know what's going on there. It's just very frustrating to me that we don't have a lot more work going on in these girls right as they're getting sick during the acute phase of this illness, rather than so much going on after the mastitis is hit, and we're really then down into the final stages of illness. In my opinion, the intramammary infections are probably somewhat secondary to the big picture that's going on earlier in the course of the infection. This is the thing that I think I've learned more from the hog industry and so much from the poultry industry, that I think infections act differently with large premises and with area high premises concentrations within small areas. If you look here on the map, this is let's see if I can get my pointer to work. So California over here on the left, doesn't seem to want to show up, but on the left in California, you can see in the lower left corner is just a map of where the dairies are located in the Central Valley of California. Extremely high concentration. Picture up on the upper left shows, I think that's probably a pork operation somewhere in the panhandle of Texas or Oklahoma. But we have huge numbers of buildings put together in these modern facilities with a lot of animals put in a fairly tight space, and a lot of these facilities are put in fairly close quarters with each other. And I think that drives the infection dynamics of from what we are used to dealing with back in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and what we're used to doing experimental work on in our lab facilities on universities and research facilities. So the theory is that large infected source populations collectively shed more virus, which makes sense. There's more animals, that there are more absolute super shedders. There's this theory that within a population, there may be certain animals that shed a tremendously large amount of virus compared to other animals. So if you have 10,000 animals on a site, there may be maybe 1 out of 1,000 that are super shedder. So if you have a large population, there's going to be more super shedders, and you're also going to shed a wider viral genomic diversity within that population just because of the number of animals. So if there's a certain strain or substrain within a population that is more easily survives more easily or is more easily pathological, that you're going to have a better chance of that virus being within the airstream, so to speak. Same thing applies on the other end. If you have a large naive population that's ready to that's sitting in these facilities, you have a bigger geographical net Just think about the number of air inlets that are available, whether that's a population of birds or whether it's a population of dairy cattle out in open pens. You've got a huge net there to catch any viable virus that may be coming its way. And then you have more highly susceptible animals. So while we talk about super shedders, we may also have populations of highly susceptible animals that are in these groups of large numbers of animals. So if there's a highly susceptible animal that happens to come across even a little bit of virus, that may cause more likely cause passage of infection from one herd to another. So it's just, I think there's a lot of evidence that's somewhat maybe what's going on.
Hey, John, you'll see that I switched out your screen just because you had flipped away from your screen. So if you want to share your presenting screen again, you could do that. You had moved away from presenting again, and it was just kind of showing everybody's pictures. And so if you want to share again, feel free to do that.
I'll give you my Venmo.
So this is an experiment that actually was done back in the days of PD and swine. They were finding a lot of spread between farms down in the Texas or Oklahoma Panhandle. And so they did the experiment down there where they were sucking up air around these facilities. And they were able to find up to 10 miles away through PCR, finding up to 8,000 viral copies per cubic meter at 10 miles from a source facility. So that's not necessarily a viable virus, but they could find quite a bit of virus up to 10 miles from facilities. And this is PD virus, not influenza. But even with influenza, they've been able to find, and there's quite a bit of work going on with this up in at the University of Minnesota with Kara Cardona and her colleagues up there, Monsignor Morel, and some of the influenza researchers up there, looking at aerosol transmission of virus. Some work's been done on influenza. Actually, in 2015, work was done with the H5N2 virus. So there is some work being done, and I think there's more and more research to show that it may well be possible for aerosolization and spread of influenza virus. And I think we just have to keep that in mind, and with these big operations especially. We tend to think, next slide, showing up about small odds adding up. You think, well, the odds are really small that a virus could blow into a farm in a day. And that's probably right. But if you think about the odds, let's just say they're 1 in 1,000 or 0.1%. If you take that out over a year, that's a 31% chance in a year that event's going to occur, just by statistics. So just because something doesn't seem like it's too likely to happen, it's not too likely that somebody's tire on a car is going to spread a virus from one farm to another either. So I think we have to really think about what are the odds of some of these things, and when you look at these big operations, what's going to happen. So, and when you look at the dairy track record, I think some of this comes into play even more. We've got several of these outbreaks now across different parts of the country. I circled them here on the map. This is a map from 2007, so it's not real current, but I don't think the locations of the big concentrations of dairy are changed. The first one is here in Texas, where the number 4 is. Those relate to percentages of milk coming from the different areas. But Texas is a huge concentrated area, and that's where we had a big outbreak. And then we moved over to Michigan. There's a concentrated area there in the central Michigan of cattle, and that's where we had a lot of cases. Every place we had, Iowa, in the far northwest corner of the state, there's concentrated dairy in Sioux County. Minnesota, central Minnesota was concentrated. Colorado was probably the granddaddy of concentrated dairy in Weld County, and that had a horrible amount of spread in a very short period of time because of concentrated herds. Idaho, number 6, same situation there. Now, of course, we're just living the nightmare in California, where we have a huge amount of concentration. So we have not had a lot of cases in areas where the herds are a little more spread out. You think of the case in Ohio that didn't go anywhere, the case in North Carolina that was kind of a singleton. So it seems like large concentrations of facilities fairly close together tend to draw multiple cases. And I think it's just may have to do with a lot of farms, with a lot of cattle being fairly close together, and then drawing spread from one farm to another. And you can look at all this, and some of our detractors are probably going to say, well, we just have to get rid of big farms and big farms close together. I think we forget that these large concentrated animal feeding operations, whether we're talking about dairy or swine or poultry or whatever, they're part of our critical infrastructure. And if we were to say tomorrow, well, we're just going to get rid of our big farms because they cause, they're too much of a risk for pandemics or whatever you want to say, or they're socially unacceptable or whatever, where would we be without them? This is a chart here that shows the amount of milk that we get from farms with 2,500 plus head and 1,000 to 2,499 head per farm. We get over 60% of our milk from farms with over 1,000 head of milking cows. And all you have to think about is what the public has said about the price of eggs and the price of milk. Well, not milk so much, just been eggs, I guess, and pork, bacon in this current election year campaign. And everyone wants to say, well, the farms are too big and we want less concentration agriculture. But if we were to wipe out the farms that some people claim are so unpopular and can't be utilized, we'd have food riots. So the point I'm trying to make is that there's price sensitivity that we kind of forget about when we talk about the things we need to change or drop. And then we've also got our image and reality we have to take into account as we think about these things. People don't think about these large farms when they think about their milk or their eggs or their pork or whatever. But the reality is this is what we're utilizing to produce our food in this country and to produce food for the whole world, actually. And if we were to wipe out this type of production in the United States, the same type of production would rise up in other parts of the world to replace it. This is the way we produce food today. It's the way it's going to be produced because technologically, this is how food can be produced with the tools that we have at this point. So we need to think hard before we say, well, the obvious answer is just to put everybody back onto 100 cow dairy farms spread out across all of the Midwest. It's not going to happen. Moving on, we'll return to that a little bit at the end, but moving on to the next slide, which is how bird food spreading potentially. I want to turn a little bit to this whole idea of the pandemic threat, the multi-species threat. This slide is one that I borrowed shamelessly from CDC. It's the line arrows in white are the known routes of spread of H5N1. The wild birds spread it to the poultry. The wild birds spread it to cows. Cows can spread it back to poultry. Cows can spread it to humans. And the cows obviously have spread it to cats, and with tragic results for the cats. We also, theoretically, cats can probably spread it to humans. We don't know that for sure, but it's certainly a possibility. And probably wild birds can spread it to humans. Cats may spread it to humans. And then I threw this in because I think this is the budding crisis that we maybe have to really start thinking about, and that's throwing pigs into the question, into the mixture. Wild birds can potentially spread it to pigs. Pigs can definitely spread avian or a swine virus to humans. We don't know about if they get the avian virus, whether they can spread it to humans, but it's certainly a possibility. Pigs are known as the mixing vessel for swine viruses. No reason that it would be any different if they get the swine virus, and so they add a potential huge amount of complexity to the problem that's already very complex. And let's go to the next slide and we'll talk a little more about it. And I'm sorry we're over time, but can we keep going or do we need to stop? Jen.
Hey, John, the beauty of it is people can come and go. So if they're willing to
Okay.
stay and listen and you're willing to keep talking, I'm willing to keep the
Okay.
webinar open.
This slide here is kind of an illustration of what happens with viral reassortment in any host, whether it's humans or pigs or whatever species we may talk about. Two influenza viruses, if they infect a cell at the same time, you can reassort the pieces of the virus within the cell, and a new virus pops out, a new influenza virus with parts of each of the parent viruses. So that's the concept of viral reassortment, and flu's all too good at that. And that the virus that comes out, most of them are duds, but once in a while you get one that's a live wire and can actually cause problems. Well, that's happened in pigs in the past, and there's good record of it. This reassorted swine virus was found in the United States, back in the early 2000s, where it was a mixture of the classical swine, a North American avian virus, and a human H3N2 virus. That's called a triple reassortant. We had a reassortment swine virus that was quite successful in the US back in the early 2000s. Well, that virus recombined in Mexico with a Eurasian swine virus, and that recombinant formed the swine origin 2009 pandemic virus. So this is a genetic map of what happened that formed H1N1 2009. This is the pandemic virus 2009. So this is the roadmap for forming that virus. It doesn't happen very often, but it happened in Mexico in the probably 2008 sometime, and that blossomed into our 2009 pandemic, which, as pandemics go, is a pretty wimpy pandemic, but it does illustrate what can happen when viruses reassort in pigs. This Eurasian virus never did get into the United States as a pure virus. It's still found in Europe and Asia in parts, but it reassorts there with other parts of viruses also. So that's reassortment, and that's what can happen when things reassort. Moving on, this is our kind of a picture of a classic H5N1 influenza concern. We've got people, we've got birds. We've always been concerned that the parts will, well, first of all, there's the risk of the virus going from the bird to the person. That arrow isn't drawn here. But the classic concern has always been that, well, a human virus and a bird virus will combine within a pig, and that'll form a new virus. They label it H1N1, but it could be an H5N1 or an H7N1 or H7 whatever. And that virus could then be a pandemic virus a reassorted virus that could be found both in pigs and could go on to people. Well, let's move to the next slide. This is what's look what we're looking at now. All of a sudden, we got a virus that is found in cows and a multitude of other species, or not multiple, but several other species that the cows can give it to. We have the possibility that virus can spread. We know it spreads to people. We've documented that. It may not cause a lot of serological reaction, but it does definitely infect people. Definitely infects birds. It goes back to birds. It is highly suspected to infect pigs. That work is going on actually right now at ARS and Ames. We'll know more about that hopefully in a month or two when Dr. Baker and her team start to report out the findings of that PSL3 work that's going on right now. In my opinion, that should have happened quite some time ago, but they've been busy putting the virus in cows and haven't had a chance to put it into pigs yet. So we'll know soon. They did put a precursor of the B313 virus into pigs, and they were able to get pigs sick. In fact, they got some neurological signs in pigs with a precursor virus. So pigs are probably likely to be susceptible to B313. We'll see soon, I guess, what happens when they report out the results. But when you think about California right now and all of the feral pigs that live in that state and all of the pigs that are raised outside as 4-H projects and outdoor pigs, I'm kind of concerned with the levels of H5N1, B313 floating around in the air out there right now. And as the weather cools and the feral pigs come down out of the hills to scavenger through the valley and eat on dead peri-domestic animals, I think we have a real opportunity there for that H5N1 virus to make its way into pigs. And hopefully we're going to be doing a lot of surveillance, particularly in feral swine, but hopefully also in some domestic swine if we can find time to do it while we're still tending to all the problems in cattle and poultry in that state. So it's a classic mixing bowl of viruses there in that state right now, and we've got to really be on our toes watching what's going on in a lot of species, not just the ones that we're worried about right now. Let's go on to the next slide. So I think this is my conclusion slide. I think H3, the B313 virus can likely infect, mutate, and reassort in both people and pigs. I don't know to what degree in either species, but I think that it's at least a theoretical possibility and maybe a likelihood to some degree that it can do it in both those species. And both people and pigs are endemically infected with at least partially human adapted H1N1 influenza viruses. So these viruses in pigs are partially human adapted because they came from humans, or else they went from humans to pigs or from pigs to humans. So they aren't that genomically distant because they've kind of been shared back and forth for 20 years or more. While most reassortants are adaptive failures, a few may eventually adapt for widespread interspecies or possible interspecies infections. So you're probably going to be lucky 999 times or 9,999 times, but sooner or later you may have a reassortant that's going to take hold. And in fact, the history of flu is that one does sooner or later. You can almost count on it. So the best defense we have is to do a whole lot of genomic sequencing, monitoring, and just all the species that are possibly affected to detect changes of concern for early stage preparedness. The sooner we can watch these things start to develop, the more defense and earlier we can get at developing vaccines and possibly doing some preventative culling or whatever it needs to happen to take care of these changes. Finally, I want to end with this slide. This article came out in Vanity Fair about a week ago. Not sure we all have to agree with every statement that was in there, and I wrote an article a little bit about it in the last day or two, but I don't care so much what's happened in the past. I think I've got plenty of disagreements, and some of us have plenty of disagreements with how this thing's been handled to date. I don't care as much what's happened to date, but we do have to start to think about what we're going to do in the future. And I think no matter what what's happened in the past, we have to work towards, I think, three real principles. First is transparency for all stakeholders. We've got cattle stakeholders, dairy cattle stakeholders on this call. We've got beef cattle stakeholders, and we've got poultry stakeholders and swine stakeholders that are all going to be affected by this, how this thing plays out in the next 6 to 9 months and beyond. And everybody has to be transparent if we're going to make this thing tolerable for anybody. And I guess I forgot to mention the biggest one of all, and that's our public health colleagues. And we're all public health colleagues because we all have our own health and the health of our families to worry about. And if I'm in this thing at this age, my ripe old age of 73 for anything, it's for my grandkids. And all of us have families that we are working for well beyond our economic and professional interests is our family interests. So it's behooves us all, second point, to collaborate with our agricultural interests, of course, but we can't forget our public health interests because that's why we have our agricultural interests, is to keep ourselves healthy food, but also healthy physically. Our physical health is more important. If we don't have physical health, the agricultural health doesn't matter. Finally, we have to have agriculture systems that generate a social contract. The people that we provide our food for they have to support how we produce our food. And we've probably ran up somewhat of a bill this past 6 or 9 months with the public based on how we've behaved on this whole dairy outbreak. I guess what I'm saying is I think we've asked a lot of the public and how we've shared or not shared some information and some transparency. And I think it's time that we really think hard about that as agricultural stakeholders. If we expect to continue to have support, we've got to really do a good job of working back towards the good graces of the public health community and all the people that continue to support us through enjoying our products. I'm not sure I said that as good as I'd like to, but I think you know what I mean. We're all in this together, and it's important that we support each other. So I'll quit with that. I'm way over time, or we're over time as a group, I guess. So I'll stop and turn it back to you, Jen.
Thank you, John. That was actually a great way to top it off. I'm just bringing this slide back to say thank you to each of you, everybody on the call who took the time out and stayed on for the entire call. But to Dr. K and Barb and Jason, who had to run, and John for taking the time to share your perspective. Again, the reason I brought you all together is I've been trying to get learn as much as I can. And you guys have been my go-to people for the last several months. And I wanted to make sure that we kind of shared that with everybody. So with that, if folks want to stay on to address the last couple of questions that came through, I'm happy to do that. But if y'all, I realize it's late where some of you are. The last couple questions that came through were specific to dry cows. Surveillance on the culled dairy cows. Actually, sorry about that. Dr. Barb mentioned this a little bit. Any other thoughts on that, Kay? I know I think for me, the thing I think about for the culled dairy cows is what Jason shared, which is the bulk tanks are positive 2 weeks before we see clinical signs. So could we be selling cows that are positive without clinical signs? Sure. Right. And so I think it goes back to this need for a community that comes together and just says, how are we going to figure this out? And tell me what I'm hearing from you all, the one thing I took away from today is testing. What are your thoughts on that, Barb and Kay and John?
So I think you hit the nail on the head. Ultimately, this is a high risk situation with culled dairy animals, particularly if they don't rebound in production. There are risk factors there. And as Barb alluded to in the chat box, it sounds like there will be some more routine testing of 800 additional dairy cow carcasses at slaughter. So hopefully those results will be forthcoming. But ultimately, I've said this from the beginning, we don't know what we don't measure, and there's absolutely no guidelines we can provide around things that we don't know. And so this is one of the burning questions that a lot of us have.
Awesome. Thanks. Anybody? Sorry, go ahead, John.
Yeah, let me add one comment on that. I think we need to understand why we're testing. If it's a food safety issue, which it conceivably could be, then I think FSIS needs to do some thinking about, can these carcasses be passed for cooking? Do they need to be condemned? What's our objective with positive carcasses? Because it's going to be a little bit impossible to know until you test whether a carcass is positive or not. So how are we going to handle that? Because you really can't expect the producer to know what he's shipping. And second of all, why are we testing? And I think the reason we need to test is to continue to watch the virus genomically. Whether a farm is positive or negative, I'm convinced we're going to end up in a situation where we're endemic, and trying to catch farms and label them isn't as important as having their collaboration in watching the virus. So we got to get away from it being a gotcha situation and get it into a, you work with us to help us watch the virus situation. So food safety is one thing, and we need to solve that. But the bigger thing is to make sure that we've got the producers on board with us watching the virus and not getting them into a situation where they want to hide the virus and we can't watch it because we're trying to hide it, if that makes sense.
It does, John. Thanks for clarifying that. I think that's another key takeaway to that is the testing, but we're not going to get there until farmers feel a bit of security and safety and being able to function and have their businesses continue in supporting that endeavor as a community. There was a question about testing and diverted milk and looking at retention ponds. I know in some states they're doing water sampling for municipal waters and tracking that, but I don't know. Last I saw there, it wasn't in every area. So I don't know if you guys have anything on that question about retention ponds and other bodies of water and groundwater, if you're familiar with any of that.
So, I mean, some of the early signals for H5 were tapped into from different entities that had started to do it in the COVID era. They would look at COVID wastewater signals as a precursor for increases, a predictive precursor for increases in hospitalization with COVID. So then they started to tap into that network. H5. It's not typed out, as I understand it, beyond just the H5, so that hemagglutinin component of it. But in the municipalities that are measuring it, you can see it when there's wastewater signals that are positive for it. Some of the concern with it is whether it's the dairy signal, because it's not typed out further than H5. You know, basically, you're not knowing if this is the beef 313 genotype, or if it's a avian origin, migratory bird origin from essentially fecal matter that's getting into waste streams. So ultimately, you'd have to type it down a little bit further to gain clarity. And then beyond that, there's a question of whether it's coming from, say, processing plants that are pulling milk from multiple infected states, or whether it's associated with effluent from dairies themselves. And so there's still a lot, to sort of dig into with that piece, but something that we should be looking at perhaps closer. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, that helps, Kate, because I think your point about processing plants too, right? There's milk runoff from there, and those plants may bring in milk from multiple states. So we talked about, somebody mentioned testing silos before, and that's not going to provide a whole bunch of information.
It's hard because it comes from, but we saw wastewater signals in Minnesota and Iowa before they reported positive dairies. So there was a bit of a predictor there. We saw wastewater signals in Arkansas. That case in Missouri is close to potentially a pocket of dairies, in that Arkansas, Missouri area. So whether that's associated with something else, it's hard to say, but we're kind of seeing it pops and then the dairies start to report in some instances.
Awesome. Thank you.
John? I think the wastewater has been vastly underutilized. I think they could, if they would be a little more proactive in how they're looking at the streams. In most cases, it's probably going to be milk processing, because there's nothing that holds a candle to milk for virus concentrations. Most wildlife is going to not be caught up in wastewater because it's in the sanitary system doesn't usually include the stormwater, and most there's very few dairy farms that actually drain into municipal sewers. They drain, most of them drain into lagoons, and so they're not caught. So most of the time it's going to be processing. Now it could be that eventually you'll end up catching some slaughter plants that get if they're slaughtering animals, but and I think there's a lot of potential to do some DNA sampling along with the virus to know whether it's cattle or poultry or whatever. So I think it'd be used a lot more, but it's just a matter of whether we want to policy-wise do that or not. And you can go ahead and sequence those. There's enough virus there to sequence and get you go ahead and put them into your databases, what the sequences are, to know what the virus is doing if you chose to do that. But that's kind of up to the FDA and CDC whether they want to use that stream as a contemporary virus source for sequencing or not.
All right, thanks, John. So the very last question, I'm just going to say thanks. Any for you, I think Kay or John, any information on gulls and dairy cattle?
So not that I'm directly aware of with gulls, but I did in the Q&A post 2 different websites that are really slick and looking at sort of the progression of this outbreak. And in those, it's basically the phylogeny of the virus, and that's in simple terms, the fingerprint of the virus. And on those websites, there are species outside of cattle and poultry that, commercial poultry, I should say, that you can see their sequences. And so I would encourage you to click on those links and kind of play around with it, because it provides a little insight in some of the wildlife that's been tested. If they are positive for the B313 genotype, then I believe it's reported here, may not be immediately, but eventually. So that's a nice resource to help you answer some of those questions.
As usual, you're the source of information. That's awesome. Thank you for giving us that direction. And thank you guys for showing up. Again, couldn't do this without you. I appreciate all your knowledge and your humble and honest approach to all of this, and for sharing the information. So with that, I'll say thank you to everybody and good night. Kay, John, and Barb, if you don't mind staying on for just a second. That's great. Thanks so much.
Thank you for the opportunity.